Ramesses II, also known as Ramesses the Great, and for good reason, was one of Egypt's most powerful and celebrated pharaohs, reigning from 1279 to 1213 BC during the New Kingdom's 19th dynasty. His was a reign lasting over 66 years that made him a legendary figure in Egyptian history, known for his ambitious building projects, including the temples of Abu Simbel and the Ramesseum, his mortuary temple. He was also famed for his role in the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, often celebrated as one of the largest chariot battles ever fought, and was the earliest well-documented battle in history. He was a builder, a warrior, a leader, solidifying his legacy as a symbol of the Egyptian Golden Age. Hello my friend, and welcome to the channel. If it's your first time here, it's great to meet you, and if you are coming back for more, great to have you back with me again. It's going to be a great video. As always, if you want to support the channel, you're already doing it. The best way is just to enjoy the videos, whatever way you seem fit. However, if you wish to go above and beyond, you will find the means to do so in the description. But for now, let's get nice and relaxed, and let's hear about the life of Ramesses II. Ramesses II was born into a pivotal era of Egyptian history. You see, his grandfather, Ramesses I, was originally a civilian, but he rose through the ranks to become a vizier and a military officer under the great pharaoh Horemheb. Recognizing his loyalty and capabilities, Horemheb chose Ramesses I as his successor, a decision that would set the stage for the ascension of one of Egypt's most formidable dynasties. As for Ramesses II, well, he was around 11 years old when his grandfather ascended the throne. This period marked the beginning of his exposure to the intricacies of Egyptian royalty and governance, a whole new world for such a young lad. The reign of Ramesses I, however, was somewhat short-lived, paving the way for Seti I, who was Ramesses II's father, to assume the throne. Under the rule of Seti I, Egypt saw a resurgence of its power. Seti was known for his military campaigns and efforts to restore Egypt's prestige, which had waned in the years prior. At the tender age of approximately 14, Ramesses was appointed Egypt's Prince Regent. A lot of responsibility for a 14-year-old. Well, this early start in the realm of governance, added with his exposure to military and administrative duties under his father's tutelage, prepared him for what was to become a legendary reign, marked by architectural wonder, extensive building programs, and military expeditions that further solidified Egypt's supremacy. Well, he ascended the throne on the 31st of May, 1279 BC, which in the Egyptian calendar corresponds to 3rd Shemu, day 27. I'm not going to explain the intricacies of the Egyptian calendar. I'm just telling you how we know the dates. Well, this day in 1279 BC marked the beginning of a reign that would last over 6 decades, which is very impressive for the time. The Jewish historian Josephus, in translating Manetho's Aegyptica, Manetho being an Egyptian historian, by the way, in his work Contra Appionum, refers to Ramesses II as Armessus Miamum, and attributes him a reign of 66 years and 2 months. Thus this figure closely aligns with the evidence from Papyrus Gorb Fragment L, which notes that the year 67, first Arket day 18 of Ramesses II reign, was immediately followed by the date marking year 1, second Arket day 19 of his son's Merneptah's reign. This suggests that Ramesses passed away approximately 2 months into his 62nd year as pharaoh. I'm inclined to believe them. My mathematics isn't so good, and neither is my knowledge of the Egyptian calendar. Perhaps a full video on the Egyptian calendar soon, Let's learn about it together. Well, to a more modern research, we have in modern times propositions that Ramesses died between the second Arket day 3 and day 13, based on the Theban Graphito 854 dated to Merneptah's year 1, second Arket day 2. However, there is a fragment from the mid-20th dynasty necropolis journal from the workmen's village of Deir el-Medina, indicating that second Arket day 6 was a feast day for commemorating the sale of Usima Re Setepenre, another name for Ramesses II, which suggested a celebration of his passing. Such of these sailing feasts, kind of like a funeral, were observed in Thebes or Deir el-Medina to honor the deified royals. For example, the sailing of Ahmose Nefertari was celebrated on the 2nd Shemu 15th, Seti 1st on 3rd Shemu 24, and Ramesses II on the 2nd Arket 6. Well, whichever case, this sailing ritual, which I'll just elaborate on quickly, essentially preparing the pharaoh and having him go down the Nile on a kind of barge, a kind of funeral popular at the time. So it was laid on a boat, covered by a kind of shrine or canopy, attended to by the priests. Well, early in his reign, he was proactive in restoring Egyptian authority over territories lost to foreign powers like the Nubians and the Hittites, and in securing Egypt's borders. Now you see, the Nubians, they were in the south, which the Egyptians viewed as Upper Egypt. You see, the flow of the Nile would go that way. So towards the Mediterranean, that would be Lower Egypt, and going south along the Nile, Upper Egypt. So south of Upper Egypt, or at least further up from the Nile, would be the Nubian kingdoms, and the Hittites were kind of near central Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. You can still see their capital city, Hattusa, in modern-day Anatolia. Quite a wonder to see, and certainly on my personal list. Add it to yours. Well, his military campaigns, of course, were not limited to the grand battles like Kadesh, which we will get to later, but they also included skirmishes and, of course, smaller conflicts that all helped to stabilize the region and maintain Egypt's influence. His efforts against the revolts in Nubia and campaigns in Libya further solidified his reputation as this formidable military leader. Thus, the Egyptian army under his command was a massive force, estimated to be around 100,000 soldiers, of course playing this crucial role in projecting Egyptian power and influence across the known world, or at least the world that was known to the Egyptians. One of these significant early military campaigns that Ramesses faced was the threat from what were known as the Shurden Sea Pirates. In the second year of his reign, these pirates were causing significant disruption along Egypt's Mediterranean coast, attacking and plundering cargo ships traveling to Egypt. The Shurden were seafaring warriors, likely originating from the coast of Ionia, southwest Anatolia, or possibly the island of Sardinia. Thus Ramesses devised a strategic plan to deal with them. He stationed troops and ships at critical points along the coast, and waited for the pirates to strike, luring them in. Well, when the Shurden pirates took the bait and engaged their targets, Ramesses' forces launched a surprise counterattack. In this decisive sea battle, the Egyptian forces managed to capture all of the pirates in a single, well-executed maneuver. It is a victory that is well documented on a stela from Tanis, which describes the Shurden pirates as having come in their warships from the midst of the sea, and none were able to stand before them. This suggests that the battle actually took place near the Nile's mouth, where Ramesses' forces were likely strategically hidden to launch their surprise attack. Well, following the victory, many of the captured Shurden were incorporated into Ramesses' bodyguard, and this was a practice that was not uncommon in ancient military strategies, to utilize the defeated foes as your own military assets. Kinda like recycling, you know what I mean. Well, these Shurden guards are easily recognizable in Egyptian inscriptions, notably those depicting the Battle of Kadesh, as they wore distinctive horned helmets with a central spike, round shields, and were armed with naue swords, a type of weapon that underscores their origins from the Aegean or Eastern Mediterranean regions. Now, it wasn't just the Shurden. Ramesses' forces also confronted and defeated other seafaring tribes during this battle, including the Luca, likely the ancestors of the Lycians, and the Shekelesh. The initial military campaigns of Ramesses set the stage for these significant conflicts to come, particularly with the much more formidable Hittite Empire. His first campaign occurred in the 4th year of his reign, and was marked by the erection of the first commemorative stele of Nar el-Kalb, near modern-day Beirut in Lebanon. However, the inscription on this stele has been mostly lost to weathering, rather unfortunate, which obscures a lot of the details of the campaign. Hopefully we can find something waiting under the ground. Those old tablets certainly seem to keep their quality. Well, during this same year, Ramesses achieved a significant victory by capturing the Hittite vassal state of Amurru during his campaign in Syria, an action that was part of a broader effort to reassert control over Canaan and push the boundaries of Egypt's influence further into Syrian territory. And speaking of which, we find ourselves at the Second Syrian Campaign, and of course, the Battle of Kadesh. Now, the most famous battle was indeed the Battle of Kadesh for Ramesses. It took place in his 5th regnal year. It was a battle that was the culmination of a campaign in Syria against the resurgent forces of the Hittite king Mu'attalis. Ramesses aimed to secure a victory at Kadesh, to extend Egypt's frontiers into Syria and eliminate the emulate, the triumph of his father, Seti I, who had entered the city a decade earlier. Thus, to prepare for such a campaign, Ramesses built his new capital, Ramesses, where he established extensive military production facilities. These factories were capable of producing significant quantities of weapons, chariots, and shields, equipping the Egyptian army for the long and difficult campaign ahead. Of course, the Hittites were, as I've mentioned, a formidable force. They weren't just a bunch of tribesmen or rebellious pirates. Nope. If the Battle of Kadesh had have gone differently, perhaps all of those long videos would be about the Hittite Empire rather than the great Egyptians. But it didn't, so here we are. Well, let's find out. After a month of advancing through Canaan, Ramesses and his forces arrived at Kadesh on the 1st of May, 1274 BC. The Egyptian troops were unexpectedly ambushed by Hittite forces, leading to a chaotic battle where the Egyptian chariotry was initially overwhelmed. However, reinforcements helped the Egyptians to counterattack and eventually rout the Hittites, who abandoned their chariots and fled across the Orontes River to safety within the walls of Kadesh. Although Ramesses held the battlefield and claimed a great victory, the strategic outcome was more complex. The inability of the Egyptians to sustain a long siege and their subsequent retreat allowed the Hittite forces to occupy, albeit briefly, Egyptian territories in the Damascus region. This outcome led many to view the campaign as a Hittite victory, despite the tactical success of the Egyptians on the field. And if you want a very detailed breakdown of the battle, I've already done a full video on it, which I'm surprised that the video about the Battle of Kadesh came before the video about Ramesses II, but thus we find ourselves in this position. Now on to the third Syrian campaign. So following the Battle of Kadesh, the Egyptian sphere of influence was confined to Canaan, while Syria predominantly fell under Hittite control. Inspired by the Egyptian military's apparent weaknesses and encouraged by the Hittites, Canaanite princes began revolts against Egyptian rule. Determined to counteract these developments, Ramesses embarked on his third Syrian campaign, late in the 7th year of his reign. The campaign was more successful against the Hittites, with Ramesses managing to split his forces effectively. Now one part of his army, led by his son Amun-her-Kepeshef, pursued the Shashu tribes across the Negev to the Dead Sea, capturing Edom Seir, and then advancing to Moab. Meanwhile, Ramesses himself led another force that attacked Jerusalem and Jericho, before also entering Moab and reuniting with his son's forces. the reunited Egyptian army continued its campaign, capturing key locations such as Hezbon and Damascus, and successfully re-establishing Egypt's influence over the territories around Damascus. In the 8th and 9th years of his reign, Ramesses continued to assert Egyptian military power far beyond its traditional boundaries. His armies crossed the Dogue River and pushed into Amurru, advancing as far north as Dapur. This region had not seen an Egyptian military presence since the time of Thutmose III, almost 120 years earlier. Ramesses II's forces laid siege to Dapur, eventually capturing the city. His journey northward was marked by the erection of the commemorative statue, signifying his presence and conquest in northern Amurru, well beyond the strategic city of Kadesh. And indeed, he loved putting up little statues everywhere. I just wish we had more of them left to see. Sands of time, I'm afraid. Well, by November of 1272, Ramesses had returned to Egypt, arriving in Heliopolis, which means the city of the sun, by the way, and that's the Greek word for it, Helios being sun and polis being city, just in case you were wondering. Well, even though he had arrived back in Egypt, his control over the newly conquered territories was certainly short-lived. The thin strip of land between Amurru and Kadesh proved to be very difficult to hold, and within a year these areas had reverted back to Hittite control. This prompted Ramesses to lead another military expedition against Dapur in his 10th year. Remarkably, during this campaign, he claimed to have entered the battle without his armor for the first 2 hours, a testament of his confidence, or perhaps arrogance, depending on who you ask. Either way, this campaign was a family affair, with 6 of his young sons participating, their youth marked by the traditional side locks of hair, we can see in some of the stelae. Now, despite his repeated military successes, the gains in these regions were simply not durable, nor were they practical to maintain. The contested territories oscillated, therefore, between Egyptian and Hittite control, with neither side able to secure a decisive and lasting victory. Ramesses' engagements in these areas, such as the captures of towns in Retjenu and Tunip in Naharin, were significant enough to be recorded on the walls of the Ramesseum, that being his mortuary temple, which we'll talk a little bit about later. Well, by his 18th year, the situation had somewhat stabilized, allowing Ramesses to put up a stele at Beth Shean on January 19th, 1261. This stele served as a symbolic assertion of his presence and power in the region, despite this ephemeral nature of his territorial control. The episode involving the deposed Hittite king, Mosili III, marks another significant moment in the diplomatic history of the ancient Near East. Mosili III fled to Egypt after his unsuccessful overthrow of his uncle, which led Hattushili III, the new Hittite king, to demand that Ramesses, the pharaoh of Egypt, extradite the fugitive prince back to Hatti. Well, Ramesses, denied him. And he said, "Well, I don't know anything about that. I don't know who you're talking about. Go away." Thus, his denial of Mursili's presence in Egypt, despite the fact he was obviously there, brought the two empires to the brink of war. However, by the 21st year of Ramesses' reign, which was around 1259, the situation evolved towards a more diplomatic resolution. Ramesses and Hattusili agreed to meet at Kadesh, the site of their earlier military standoff, to negotiate a peaceful end to the conflict. And they did. The meeting resulted in the earliest known peace treaty in world history. And in fact, if you go to the UN headquarters, a copy of this peace treaty hangs up on the wall. It's a very historic document. I wonder if they had have known back in those years when Ramesses had sat down with Hattusili, if this would be such an important event. Well, perhaps they did. Who knows? Either way, the peace treaty is notable for several reasons. It was recorded in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform, with both versions largely agreeing on content, though differing slightly in perspective. The Hittite version claims that the Egyptians sought peace, whereas the Egyptian version said that the Hittites were the ones who came to them to ask for peace. Well, it could be either way. Either way, the treaty was engraved on a silver plaque, which was then taken back to Egypt and inscribed into the walls of the temple at Karnak. This preserved text for posterity and signified its importance. Well, the treaty's 18 articles not only called for peace between the two empires, but also emphasized that this peace was mandated by the gods of both lands. And while the treaty did not explicitly define the borders, other documents like the Anastasi A papyrus help infer that the Phoenician coastal towns up to Sumer were under Egyptian control. And that's not the Sumer you're thinking of. That was long gone, but we think of Sumer, the Egyptian city. Well, marking the northern boundaries of Ramesses' influence. So it was not too clearly defined in the original agreement, but further documents tended to put things into a bit more perspective. Now, following the treaty, there were no further Egyptian military campaigns in Canaan, indicating a stable and secure northern border for Egypt under Ramesses II. This period of peace allowed the pharaoh to strengthen his rule domestically until his death. The diplomatic correspondence between Hattusili III and Kadashman Enlil of Babylon reflects a broader implication. Hattusili's letters suggested a shift in regional dynamic, where former adversaries were now encouraging cooperation against common enemies, for example, Assyria. This change was part of a larger pattern where major powers sought stability through diplomacy rather than continued conflict. What a novel idea. Well, Ramesses' campaigns into Nubia now, particularly south into the first cataract of the Nile, form a significant part of his military legacy that's not often talked about. Pretty much anything to do with Ramesses lives under the shadow of the Battle of Kadesh and the peace agreement. Well, by the age of 22, he was actively leading military expeditions into Nubian territory, demonstrating an early involvement in Egypt's colonial and military activities. And during these campaigns, he was not only at the forefront of the battle, but he brought along his sons, a family affair, as part of the royal entourage, indicating his role in their military training and intention to showcase the continuity of rule and valor. The conquest and continued dominance over Nubia were important for Egypt both strategically and economically. Nubia had been under Egyptian control for around 200 years by the time of Ramesses. But the region's rich resources and its strategic position as a buffer against other African powers made its reassertion a significant focus for Ramesses' military efforts. These campaigns and their significance are vividly recalled in the decorations of several temples Ramesses constructed in northern Nubia. The temples at Beit al-Wali, Gurf Hussein, and Kalab Shah are adorned with reliefs and inscriptions that detail these military exploits. In fact, the Oriental Institute's epigraphic work during the Nubian salvage campaign of the 1960s helped to uncover and preserve these vital records. One of the most telling depictions of these campaigns is found on the south wall of Beit el-Wali temple. Here, Ramesses is depicted charging into battle on his war chariot against the tribes of south of Egypt. What is notable about this depiction is the presence of his two young sons, being Khaem-Wamset and Amun-er-Khepeshef, who are portrayed behind him in their very own war chariots. A portrayal that not only emphasizes Ramesses' role as a warrior king, but also highlights once again these familial aspects of the campaigns, Ramesses preparing his sons the only way he knows how. Of course, it's always best to learn on the job, right? Well, another intriguing aspect of these campaigns, as depicted on the temple walls, is Ramesses' claim of having engaged in battle against certain tribes without the aid of his soldiers. That's right. Well, this could suggest a surprise attack or a special expedition where Ramesses felt compelled to simply demonstrate his personal bravery and leadership by fighting without the usual military support, possibly in a skirmish or sudden confrontation with local tribes. So, during Ramesses II's reign, Egyptian influence extended significantly along the Mediterranean coast, particularly over a 300-kilometer stretch up to Zawiet el-Rakam, where evidence of Egyptian fortifications have been found. These fortresses, built on what was referred to as Libyan land, indicate that Egypt exerted some degree of control over this region, although the precise military and political circumstances of these fortifications remain somewhat unclear. While detailed records of Ramesses' military campaigns against the Libyans are sparse, various inscriptions hint at his victories over them. These references might be retrospective, celebrating his involvement in campaigns led by his father, Seti, who likely established initial control over the region and initiated the construction of these defensive structures. This would mirror Seti's efforts to rebuild and fortify the ways of Horus across the northern Sinai, suggesting a strategic approach to securing Egypt's frontiers. By the 30th year of his reign, Ramesses celebrated his first Sed festival, a jubilee event intended to rejuvenate the pharaoh's strength and honor his rule. This marked Ramesses as one of Egypt's most enduring rulers, a king whose reign would eventually span 66 years, unheard of, really, making him an exceptional figure among the pharaohs, not just for his longevity, of course, but also for his accomplishments. But hey, longevity always gets you points. Now, at this point in his reign, Ramesses had not only ensured peace and security along Egypt's borders, but had also overseen a period of prosperity and monumental building that revived Egypt's power and prestige. His achievements by his 30th year had already far surpassed those of most of his predecessors. So, he continued to celebrate these Sed festivals, traditionally held every 3 years after the 30th year. However, Ramesses, ever the exceptional ruler, held these festivals sometimes every 2 years. Everyone loves a good party, don't they? Celebrating an unprecedented 13 or 14 such festivals during his long reign. Well, by the end of the reign, he had embarked on an extensive building program that was unparalleled in scope since the era of the pyramids, which was, by the way, some 1500 years earlier. He mobilized the Egyptian population to transform the landscape from the Delta to the Nubia, leaving an architectural legacy that surpassed any pharaoh before. So here's a look at some of the significant aspects of his building initiatives. He was known for remodeling and usurping the works of his predecessors, transforming existing temples across Egypt, particularly in Thebes, ensuring that these spaces celebrated his divine nature and power. And celebrate they did. By modifying these structures, he shoehorned himself into the narrative of Egyptian gods and kingship. Unlike the shallow reliefs of previous pharaohs in the masonry and artistic space, which was susceptible to being erased and overwritten by successors, Ramesses had his carvings much deeper engraved into the stone, a technique that not only preserved his inscriptions from being easily altered, but also made them more prominent under the Egyptian sun, reflecting his association with the sun god Ra. He also used art to propagate his victories and achievements. Temples and other structures across Egypt were decorated with reliefs that depicted his triumphs over foreign enemies, serving as visual propaganda that reinforced his image as this powerful warrior king. Thus his cartouches and images appeared everywhere, even on structures that he did not originally build. Oh, that word just then, cartouche. It's the French word for bullet. And the reason why they called them cartouches, well, if you look at a lot of the name stels of the old Egyptian pharaohs, they're often wrote in this bullet-shaped border. Thus, when the French were excavating and during that golden age of archaeology, pilfering a lot of little artifacts, they called these inscriptions cartouches. So there you go. Well, his desire to be omnipresent led to his name and likeness being a common sight across countless monuments and buildings throughout all of Egypt. In fact, Ramesses established a new capital city called Ramesses in the Nile Delta, which had served as a summer palace during his father Seti I's reign. This new capital was not just a political center, but also a manifestation of Ramesses' vision and his desire to create a legacy that would endure through the ages. He also expanded gold mining operations, which were mainly around Akuyati, which is modern-day Wadi al-Aki, helping to finance his extensive building projects and, of course, bolster the economy of Egypt. Take a cheeky little bit for yourself, too, Perhaps one of his most famous architectural developments was the temple complex at Abu Simbel, carved out of a mountainside and renowned for its colossal statues of Ramesses at its entrance. These temples celebrate his reign and his divine status, and were designed to awe both his subjects and the gods. Next, of course, is the Ramesseum, a mortuary temple in western Thebes, built by Ramesses between Kurna and the desert, an object of awe since the 19th century. Now, unfortunately, it lies mostly in ruin. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, I'm sure you're familiar with, once marveled at this gigantic temple complex, showcasing the grandeur of Ramesses' reign. The temple was oriented northwest to southeast and featured a sequence of courts leading up to the main temple area. The complex started with an enormous pylon that formed the first court, where scenes depicted Ramesses and his army triumphing over the Hittite forces at the Battle of Kadesh. Adjacent to this pylon was, of course, the royal palace, and at the back stood a colossal statue of Ramesses. Though only fragments of the base and torso remain today, the original stood at over 17 meters tall and weighed over 1,000 tons. That's pretty heavy. The second court contained part of the pylon's internal facade and a portion of the Osiride portico. Here, the walls narrate the story of the battle against the Hittites, with scenes of war and the pharaohs' victories. The upper registers of this court, there are scenes honoring Min, the god of fertility, depicting feasts and celebrations. The grand hypostyle hall, measuring 41 by 31 meters, still has 39 of its original 48 columns standing. The columns are also adorned with scenes of Ramesses before various gods. Portions of the whole ceiling, decorated with gold stars on a blue background, are preserved, adding a celestial touch to the grandeur of the hall. The walls also feature processions of Ramesses' children, hinting at the familial aspect of his reign. Surrounding the main temple were extensive storerooms constructed from mud brick, which outline the functional aspects of the temple's operations. Traces of a scribe school found among the ruins indicate the temple's role in education and administrative work. Thus, the Ramesseum not only served as a religious center, but as a monument to Ramesses' military achievements and divine status. Sadly, of course, it's now a shadow of its former self, a ruin, a dusty, old, broken ruin. What a shame. Well, that brings us to the end of our video about Ramesses. His impact on Egypt was indeed profound. A reign of 66 years and 2 months. By the time of his death, he was approximately 90 years old, and that is a very good innings for those days. Of course, his advanced age brought with it many health issues, as of course it always does, including severe dental problems, arthritis, and the hardening of the arteries. Despite the personal ailments, he had brought considerable wealth to Egypt through the vast supplies and spoils he had amassed from various empires. He outlived many of his wives and children, and changed Egypt forever, especially with the monuments and temples that he left behind. A legacy so influential that 9 subsequent pharaohs adopted the name Ramesses in his honor. Surely a testament to an enduring legacy and the high regard in which he was held for generations to come. Of course, we're still talking about him now, aren't we? So many thousands of years later. Well, that's it for Ramesses. I'd like to thank my top-tier patrons and members. We have Tim, Wendy, Jeffrey, JC, Stark Factory, Britt, and Charles. Thank you very much, especially Charles for his comments. I see you in the comments, Charles. Thank you very much for your extra knowledge. Stark Factory too, always chiming in. JC, I hope you're doing well. I haven't heard from you in a while. Hope you're doing okay out there, mate. Well, I will see you tomorrow, same time, same place, where the history keeps rolling on. Good night, everyone. Best of luck to you. Love you dearly.